everybody. Today is Tuesday, October 30th, and Ray McGovern is here with us. Welcome back, Ray.
Thank you, Dima.
Let's start with the Israeli attack on Iran. When you look at the attack and the way that Israelis are talking about, Iranians are talking about the attack, what's your take? How did you find this attack?
Well, that was a delimited attack. It did very little damage. And the question is why the Israelis, after promising much more, or threatening much more, to include a great surprise, why it was so delimited and, by all accounts, that I believe, ineffectual. Well, I had been saying for a while that there was a precedent here where our military, that is the US Pentagon, was leaning on President Biden not to get involved in any foolish enterprises such as had been advised to him by people like Antony Blinken, arch Zionist, and with no experience at all in military matters. Now, that worked with respect to Ukraine. We won't go over that, but 6 weeks ago, when the president was all set by Blinken to approve longer reach firings of U.S. guided missiles into Russia proper, the military stood up, and that was so clear. All you had to do was see who briefed even before the president decided. And the military was saying, "No, it's not a good idea." And the president, very, very disappointedly, said, "No, Mr. Starmer, British Prime Minister, no, sorry, put away your target list. We're not going to do that." Okay. Now, there's still plumbing for him to do that, but the example is there. Now, here's the Israelis, their military, and Netanyahu. And they're saying, okay, now we're going to go get those Iranians really, really bad. And then the Iranians are going to inevitably retaliate. And my God, they can do a lot of damage. So this is a sure way of getting the U.S. in, right? That's Netanyahu's calculation. And what better time than right before a U.S. election? Biden will have no other option. Well, their military, which talks to our military, the way I reconstructed, and this is not the first time I said this, our military said, look, we think this is really stupid. We don't want to get involved in a regional war, and we're going to tell the president that. And the last time we told the president something like that, he listened to us, not to Netanyahu's lawyer, whose name happens to be Tony Blinken, okay? So we can't guarantee that if you guys start and you get whipped or you get real trouble like you're having now in southern Lebanon, we're going to tell the president, look, we told him this was going to happen. Don't let him mousetrap you. Now, I think that's what happened. I think that the Israeli military didn't want any part of this. U.S. military, no part of this. And that's my favored explanation. Now, there are other explanations out there. Actually, Alistair Crook has a really good explanation where he thought that, he's been told, and his sources are usually quite good, that there were three waves of this attack, the second two of which, number 2 and number 3, were canceled when the first one had absolutely no success in clearing the way and encountered new defenses that the Israelis had not been aware of. I don't know about that. That's the only way we have that information. And there is one wisp in the wind on that. I remember seeing the Israeli spokesman, the fellow who stands up there like military spokesman, and he says, okay, this is the end of wave 1. Wave 2 is about to begin. I did see that. I'm not imagining it, okay? A half hour later, he apparently said, well, there's going to be no wave 2 or wave 3. We're finished. We hope Iran will come to its senses and not retaliate. So that's the only whisper in the wind that I have as sort of a confirmation or affirmation of some kind of what Ulster has collected. But again, Ulster's sources are quite good. Those are the two main explanations. That's how I read it. And if I'm true, or if my guesses have been correct, then that means something, because Finally, our military is standing up, and that will have its reverberations on Ukraine, as well as West Asia, as well as East Asia. I think our military is finally realizing that we're not in really good shape, that we can't take on two fronts, we can't take on three fronts, and that NATO is actually an empty shell. There's not much there. And but not only that, but we have no weapons to give anybody anymore. We're running out of missiles for our own protection. The only reason we can be somewhat comfortable, and this is key, Nima, the only reason that our Pentagon can be somewhat comfortable is that there is no offensive threat from Russia or from China or, God help us, from Iran or North Korea. Now, all of those four have the means to have an offensive threat, including North Korea, which has ballistic missiles that could reach any part of the United States. Uh, but they don't have any real incentive to do that. So a lot of this is artificially stoked to justify arms expenditures, to justify working on very sophisticated weaponry like F-15s, which, if Alistair Crook's sources are right, were defeated. They're supposed to be real stealthy, but somehow some kind of radar can detect them anyway. So we make all these fancy weapons and we can't fight a conventional war, but that's okay. We're still comfortable because there ain't going to be no conventional war because Russia's not going to go into Poland or into the Baltic. I don't know how people can believe that that's what Russia wants to do, but lots of people do believe it. And we have the German defense minister talking about, oh, we got to be ready by 2029. Yeah, that's it. We're building all the Panzer and all that. We'll be ready. Well, come on. There's no offensive threat. That explains why there are no 155 millimeter shells. That explains why we're running out of missiles. For God's sake, let's come to our senses and recognize that we've been conned. I'll finish this little section with a quote from one of the leaders, a gutsy woman. I think she's only 49 years old, for God's sake, half my age. Okay? Her name is Sevim Dagladin, okay? And she put it this way in German, in terms of what's been sold to the people of Germany as well as the United States. She said, unsere erste Pflicht ist, sich bei diesem Königreich Vergnügen nicht dumm machen zu lassen. Okay, it means, I just love it. It means, our first duty, erste Pflicht ist, sich nicht von diesem, our first duty is amid this Königreich, this kingdom of Lügen, of lies, nicht dumm, okay, not to let ourselves be made dumb. And as the election approaches, the electorate here in the United States is largely dumb, not by their own fault, but by the fact that the media has been captivated by the same corporations that profiteer from the wars. For God's sake, look at them. So that's why I'm just delighted to come on your program. Nima, you have all kinds of thousands and thousands of people who might be able to do something if it's only spreading the word around that there's true truth and then there's alternative truth, and what you can hear on your station, your webcast is true truth to the degree we can come at it.
Ray, when you look at the way that Iran and the United States are talking about each other, with the Biden administration, we know, as you've mentioned, they're not interested in having any sort of direct conflict, direct war with Iran in the Middle East. And in my opinion, they did everything to put an end to this conflict between Israel and Iran. And Antony Blinken was trying to do that. And on the other hand, we're hearing from the Republican Party, Donald Trump and his pick for the vice president, J.D. Vance. Both of them are talking about that we are not interested in having a war with Iran in the Middle East. Doesn't matter how much Israelis are pushing for this type of war. And how about who's benefiting from this attitude that Iran is our ultimate enemy in the Middle East? We have to go to war with Iran. And everybody knows what has happened in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and who was behind the conflict in Iraq. And right now, it seems the same kind of people are pushing for the same kind of policies that led to that disaster in Iraq and Afghanistan.
That's right, Nima. The problem is that Israel, the Israeli leaders, the ones in power, and their affiliates in Washington, the ones in power in Washington, are joined at the hip and they are in power, so to speak. In other words, the US government is not unanimous here. Tony Blinken has been able to assert his will, even to the point of lying to Congress, denying that people in Gaza were being starved to death. My God, when major people, including U.S. institutions like the U.S. aid agency, were saying, of course they're being starved. They're not letting the trucks in, for God's sake. And every day, more and more people are starving there. So Tony Blinken lies about that. So we have, in my view, two factions: the ones that are really, really Zionists. Par excellence, and they have Biden's ear, who also styles himself as the arch Zionist. Sullivan, maybe a little bit less so, but he's Jacob Isaiah Sullivan, if I remember, Jeremiah Sullivan or something like that. He's got roots in Israel as well. So there are those against who? The people who have served in uniform, the few people who know about war. Not many of our leading generals and so forth really know about a real war, but they know what it would be to make a real war against Russia, and they're putting the restraining cords on. Um, you know, after it's a sad history, but after Putin came into office in 2001, he reached out and said, "Hey, let us join NATO." I mean, there's no real we're we have no military, to speak of. And he kept being rejected. And in 2007, he said, "All right, well, we'll give it a real good try." I remember the photos at Munich at the Security Council. There's Bobby Gates and other people smiling and smirking. "Oh yeah, right. You Russians are going to do something. You're flying their back. You can't do anything." Well, Putin was as good as his warnings. And as he warned a couple of years later, we're not going to try to build systems that don't work. I mean, you build systems that don't work because there's lots of people make lots of money from systems that don't work, like ABM systems. Okay, you might remember that back in 1972, we realized that, at least we Russians did, says Putin, ABM systems can't work. There can always be a counter system developed to get through that. Those you can't shoot down 1,000 missiles at the same time, okay? And we can do that, okay? So we stopped, says Putin. We stopped building an ABM system, and we developed things like hypersonic missiles and all manner of other things, strategic as well as tactical, that go really fast, really, really fast, and carry quite a payload. And I think it was 2018, Putin, in a very rare address, it was the State of the Nation address, like the State of the Union address here. He did a little slideshow and he said, "Okay, this is what this missile can do. And this one goes around the South Pole. Okay, so here, build a ABM system against that. And this one does." It was like he was selling these missiles. Well, that was not 5 years ago. That's 9 years ago, or whatever. Okay. Yeah, 8 and 2 and 6 years ago. And they built those things. Okay. And we know what hypersonic missiles are. And the oddity is, the unexplainable reality is that the U.S. has not been able to develop those kinds of missiles. Maybe all the really smart people are working on these F-16s, which may not be all that stealthy anymore, besides not being able to work very well in the dark or in a rainstorm. So, yeah, it's a long story, but the missed opportunities here are what cry out for explanation. And the reality is that Americans have been deprived of all this for for the last decade because our media has been molded by the people who own our media, and those are the same people who are war profiteers. They all work for the same boss. And, you know, if you look at what percentage of their income comes from their media enterprise, well, maybe only 5%. It gets paired with F-35, but my God, it works. There are no alternatives except, as I say, and I hope you make it to 500,000 too, Nima, people like you.
Ray, the other thing would be the conflict in Lebanon. Do you think that the reality of what's going on in Lebanon gonna get into the mind of Israeli people at the end of the day? Are we heading toward that moment?
I think we're heading toward that moment, Nima, but all too slowly. Uh, as I read it, the Israeli population has to realize that this is not a good idea to exact vengeance for October 7th on an entire population in Gaza. And that war in Gaza has not been successfully concluded. Now they're trying to starve most of the people in northern part of Gaza. Well, that may work maybe for another week. We'll see what happens, who wins the election. But to let people starve to death when the food is waiting at the gates to come in is something that civilized nations probably won't allow for much longer. So it seems to me that after a while, vengeance will recede, poverty and relocation. Those 60,000 or so folks that used to live in northern Israel are settlers. They can't go back to their homes, and Netanyahu is not going to be able to make it so that they can. Gradually, they'll come to the realization this was a fool's errand, and worst of all, if people come in the United States and say, look, we gave you everything you needed, you're on your own now. As unlikely as that appears at this point, who knows? The Israelis really have to be afraid of that. So I see change coming, but only when the Israeli people, as well as the Israeli leaders, realize that the game is up and that they've lost definitively, and the only thing left to lose is support from the U.S. If they keep going out on a limb, they might lose that too.
We know that the new Secretary General of Hezbollah today he was talking about that they're prepared to fight against Israel for the weeks and months to come. And on the other hand, it seems that in Israel, they're talking about that we're winning with those assassinations. And right now, in the southern part of Lebanon, they're trying to convince their people that they're winning in southern part of Lebanon. Do you think that Israel is benefiting from those assassinations, or we are witnessing the same Hezbollah that they were fighting Israel for years in the southern part of Lebanon?
Well, first, I'd add the remarks that Naim Qassem made today. He also said we're willing to negotiate. We're willing to talk with Israel as long as the terms are fit for us as well. So he's doing both things. And in answer to your basic question, no, it makes no difference how many Hamas leaders, how many Hezbollah leaders you kill. There are always people to take their place. All it does is make it worse for the Israelis over the long term because all these people become martyrs, and martyrs have a special appeal to people who believe that if they fight for their justice, for their fight for their independence, that they deserve a special place in heaven. I mean, after all, a lot of my Irish forebears felt the same way when the British occupied and abused the Irish population. Many of them perished, not only in battle but in the artificially kept famine. So I come from a history where people, my great grandparents, survived the famine, but the ones before that did not. Okay. And many of my uncles were fighting in the IRA, and it wasn't until just a few decades ago when that stopped and there's prospects for progress in Ireland now. So this may be I think it's an apt analogy. Things change, okay? People grow up. And this confessional war between Protestants and Catholics, that was really stupid to begin with. And statesmen came to Jerry, what's his name, people came to the fore here and negotiated, and the U.S. played a decent game. Even if you want to say something good about Bush, I mean, about Clinton, and about what that fellow, Tony Blair, there in England. Well, to their credit, they helped bring that thing to an end. So it takes a long time, a very long time, sometimes centuries. In this case, it's going to happen much quicker, but not quick enough for most of our tastes.
Yeah. And do you think that with the negotiations that are happening or were happening in Qatar between the head of CIA, head of Mossad, and together with Qataris, they were talking about Gaza and the situation. I believe that they want to find a solution, but how can we understand the nature of the talks that are happening between these three parties, which we know that Hamas is not part of these talks? And as long as you don't have Hamas, talking to Hezbollah is, they're talking about, we're gonna expect, we're gonna accept anything that Hamas is agreeing on. And here is Hamas, the key of the conflict in Gaza, in Palestine. Do you think that the people who are talking to each other in Qatar are considering Hamas, and what are they thinking about what's going on in Gaza?
It's a charade, or as the British would say, it's a charade. Okay. Bill Burns has a new plan, right? As you point out, Hamas is not directly involved, although they are there in Doha, in Qatar, and that's why they're there. The, the folks there bring them into these conversations at one remove. But the whole thing could end today. And when people ask Bill Burns, why don't you just stop giving arms aid to Israel? What does he say to them? I mean, really, how do you reply to that? The whole thing could stop overnight if you do that. So Bill Burns is in a, it's a ridiculous position. And he is a policymaker. I mean, this is big. He's not only head of CIA intelligence, he's he's in the cabinet. He makes policy. So the policy is built, presumably or theoretically, on intelligence served up by the CIA. So he serves up intelligence, and to please the president, he says, "Oh, there's still a hope. Oh, yeah, we'll get those Egyptians. We'll get those Israelis. We'll find." Because after all, I'm doing it. I do this thing really well, right? So that's what he's telling the cabinet. Can you see the problem there? Heads of the CIA should never be a member of the cabinet. Burns has this special little glow about him, I guess. And, when he's been so wrong on Ukraine, when he told the president on the 6th of July last year, Putin has lost definitively. His armed forces have been shown up for ineffectual for the whole world to see. And Biden gets up in Helsinki 6 days later, says the same thing. 13th of July last year. Look it up, okay? Putin has lost, already lost, right? Well, hello. Here's the problem. Does anyone in Congress ask Bill Burns to come in and say, now, Mr. Burns, that was what, July, August, September. So that was 15, 16 months ago. What happened? I mean, what happened? Oh, did the North Koreans come in to help? Oh, no, that was just recently. Well, what happened? What's Burns going to say? Well, the problem is he's not asked those questions because Congress is submissive to the executive branch in a way that it never has been before. So the problem is there's no accountability. Burns can say Putin lost in July of last year. Now he can say Putin's about to win unless we give more blah, 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 blah in October of the following year, today, 2024. So, yeah, that's my take on Bill Burns. To the degree he's doing any good in Doha, this really depends on his credibility. And when he has no answer to the question, why don't you stop arms supply to Israel? When he has no answer to that question, then he has no credibility at all. That's my take.
And I'm glad that you've mentioned the situation in Ukraine about the North Korean soldiers being in Ukraine. Ray, what's going on with this new rhetoric? We know that Russia doesn't need North Korean soldiers. And why are they talking about this in a manner that is so important? Let's talk about it. Let's discuss many issues that it seems that they were talking about. Let's bring South Korean to fight the North. It's unbelievable the level of rhetoric right now, and they're trying to manage the situation in Ukraine. Do you think that they're getting prepared to put troops on the ground in Ukraine, as we know that the situation is not that good in Ukraine right now? Their military, their army is not good right now. It's not in a good shape. What's the reason behind this new rhetoric, in your opinion?
Well, Nima, you put some very, very pleasant words to describe the situation in Ukraine. For Ukraine, it is not good to the nth degree. They've had very rapid reversals to the point where, if I can read maps correctly, the Russians could do a major big arrow advance to the Dnieper River far above Kherson, where they're already on the west bank of the Dnieper River very quickly, even before next Tuesday, if they so chose. Okay, I don't think they're going to do that, but that's how much they have been winning. Okay, and some U.S. generals have pretty much admitted. One of them saying, the Russians are much stronger now than they ever were before, especially in Ukraine. So how do you read all this stuff? Well, it's confusing enough. These things started with Zelensky, and I think the Financial Times and some people in the U.S. and even then comes David Sanger. Okay, he's a weather vane. He's the CIA leaky. I mean, they leak to. They give him stories. Look at what happened to WMD. Sanger said in one article back in July of 2002, 7 times weapons of mass destruction or flat fact in Iraq. Okay, so they tell him what to say, and he says it. And so he was, they said, there'll be 3,000, maybe 10,000 coming in there. So what's the whole deal? You're right. The basic thing is the Russians don't need North Koreans in there. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean there are no North Koreans in Russia? Of course not. There are probably thousands of them in joint training with the Russians out in the Far East. Now, has a division or a battalion or a company come into Kursk, which is Russia proper, invaded by Ukraine, actually invaded by NATO because Ukraine was using all NATO weaponry. So here's a case where Putin is biding his time. He's already killed about 13,000 of those people who came into Ukraine came into Kursk from Ukraine. and he's just going to finish them off. But why would he need North Koreans to do that? He doesn't. So, is there a chance that some North Koreans would appear there? I think so, but what would that be? It wouldn't be because they're needed. It would be to advertise the fact, as Putin has pretty much done in those interviews he gave, mostly in Kazan there during BRICS, okay? What he said was, look, oh, so there are satellite photos of North Koreans in Russia. Isn't that interesting? There might be something to that. But then he said, look, we have a mutual defense treaty with North Korea. You know what that means? Nuclear defense. A mutual defense treaty means, and the language in Article 4, says Putin, is very precise. It says when another country suffers an armed invasion from the country with which you are bound by this treaty, you are immediately required to spring to its aid with military help and all kinds of help. Okay, that's the treaty we have with North Korea. Okay, so if North Korean soldiers are in Kursk, well, they're fulfilling their mutual defense treaty obligations. They're coming to our help in case we need it. Okay. So if you get that through your head, West, that's what this is all about. And by virtue of this treaty, should someone in the Far East try to stir up trouble against our allies, North Korea, we will be mutually obligated to come to their aid. So this has substance to it. And to the degree that these North Korean soldiers, if any, they're coming west, exist, and that would be I think, uh, the real reason, or the rhetorical, or the dramatic reason to say, look, we have allies too, not only Belarus, but now we have North Korea, and we have China and Iran as virtual allies. And that is another interesting thing here. The pact with Iran, the Russian-Iran treaty, 20 years now. They've been working on it almost 3 years. And earlier this year, it was said it was already now. It's going to be strategic to the nth degree. They probably wouldn't call it a mutual defense treaty as with North Korea, but it's real. It's going to be signed at BRICS, okay? And then before BRICS, all of a sudden, Pezeshkian, the president of Iran, goes to meet Putin in Central Asia a week before BRICS. And he comes back and he says, well, people said we were going to sign the treaty. Well, it's ready, but we hope that it'll be signed at BRICS. Well, for months and months, it was a done deal. It was to be signed at BRICS, but then it wasn't. Now, I'm not sure. I think the last thing I said, oh yeah, it's going to be signed pretty soon. Okay, why the delay? It seems to me that if the American military has been restraining the Israelis so as to prevent a wider regional war in that area, the Russians have been doing their part by restraining the Iranians. And the worst thing they could do would be to give them a mutual defense treaty or something tantamount to that, and give them the notion that, oh yeah, we Iranians can bloody the noses not only of the Israelis but of the Americans, because the Russians don't want that to happen. So I saw that initially, and I think that's still true. I believe it's still to be the operative fact here as to why there is no treaty signed between Russia and Iran, because once there is, then Russia has a mutual obligation to help Iran, whether it's literally as explicit as in the North Korean Russian treaty or not. It'll be a step toward that, and I think that's a good thing. And I further think that there is an open communication line between our Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin and what's his name, the fellow in Moscow, the defense minister there. They're coordinating these things, and I mean, I don't know if they're coordinating, but they're in touch with each other. And my guess, and it's just a guess, is that Austin is telling Belousov, the defense minister, look, we're doing our best to restrain the Israelis. Uh, they wanted to do X, and we persuaded them to do Y. Now, would you try to work your will or try to restrain the Iranians so that if the Israelis do Y, that they don't do Y plus, that they can kind of stop the escalation? That's speculation that is not based on the kind of facts I like to use, but I think it's played a role in tampering down this thing to the degree it has been. And I did see something today where it looks like the Iranians, although they've been back and forth, they may not retaliate for the latest Israeli thing, and that would put the lid on it for a while. So now, is this a good thing? Oh, yeah, it's a really good thing. Is Tony Blinken in on the act? No. This is defense minister, the defense minister. Is that a bad thing? In my view, this is a very, very good thing. And we do know, it has been reported, that even Sullivan, when the military faced into Sullivan, he, after all, is the president's national security advisor. And they said, look, on Ukraine, don't authorize the use of these strike weapons. Number one, we don't have so many. Number one, it's not going to do any good. Number two, number three, it's going to alienate the Russians to the point where these red lines, once having been violated, Putin will have to do something that we won't really like to have done. So getting back to that, let me just finish up on Korea. There was a report about 2.5 weeks ago now by a Russian blogger. Murat is his first name. Karagulin, I think is his last name. He's pretty distinguished and pretty credible and good ties with the Russian military and with the Russian political leaders. And he spread this story that South Korea is providing pilots and F-16 aircraft for use in Ukraine. They'll go to an airfield in Romania, near the Ukrainian border, for use once when the pilots are there and all. As a matter of fact, he said some of the pilots were already there, and this is very serious if true, because do the South Koreans have F-16s? Well, they have 150 of them. Do they have pilots? Really good pilots. Oh, but do they speak English? They speak very good English, okay? So, would they fit in? Yeah. Is there a need for them? Well, yeah. QED, what remains to be demonstrated is the fact that, this one Ukrainian pilot, their ace got shot, or something happened to him, and the plane crashed, okay, the first time that's a couple of months ago now. So do they need, if they're going to have F-16s, and they do apparently have a handful in Romania, would the South Koreans bring F-16s into Romania and use their pilots to do this? My God, I don't know how crazy the South Korean leaders are, but they are sort of enmeshed in the neocon system of our country. The word from my South Korean analyst says, well, no, this would never go over. If they got shut down, this would be a bad thing politically for the leaders of South Korea. But, I don't rule it out. And so if that's the case, and as I say, they're needed, they're available, they're all the things that the Ukrainians would lust after. If they show up there in the next day or two, or if Washington decides to make an announcement, since the North Koreans, got it now? Since the North Koreans are sending troops to help Russia, South Korea has told us they're sending pilots and F-16s to help from their side. And this is going to be the cavalry coming in, and Ukraine will be saved because these South Korean pilots are really, really good, and Russia won't have a chance against them. Now, that may work for a few days, but it's only a couple of days before the election. So again, speculation. But if you're looking for an October or real early November surprise, this would be one candidate that I offer.
Ray, do you think that Russians are concerned about the escalation in Ukraine? That's why they're talking about their nuclear bombs, their nuclear capabilities right now.
I think the Russians are talking about nuclear capabilities because they realize that the West is flat on its back. That however much sensible military at the Pentagon realize what the ramifications of this would be. The Secretary General of NATO, he didn't know anything about this. Rutte, and all of those rabid people in Europe are plumbing for worse and worse. So I think, as I've always said, that what the Russians are doing should be looked in terms of deterrence. Okay, and the fact that deterrence doesn't work unless you make it in some way visible, especially when you have people wet behind the ears like Sullivan and Blinken. So what do? You do more than just declaratory intent. You exercise these nuclear weapons. You actually exercise the tactical ones with Belarus, okay? And then, my God, there's a big exercise going on now, a general staff exercise there with nuclear weapons. And you do that kind of thing too. Now, this shouldn't be necessary to give some pause to the planners in the Pentagon. But I'm afraid Putin has concluded, and probably correctly, that it is necessary to give this kind of ammunition to the planners in the Pentagon, who can reasonably be expected to go to the White House and to Tony Blake and say, "My God, you know what's going on here? You know about these exercises?" In November of 1983, we almost did in the whole world when there was a grand nuclear exercise from our side. We didn't realize that the Russians were interpreting as the real thing. We knew from the few assets we had in the KGB that they were indeed saying, "Whoop, the flag is up. They're going to attack." Why? Because it involved everyone, including the vice president, for the first time ever. And all kinds of alarm bells were going up in Moscow. And I've perhaps mentioned this before, but to his eternal praise, a fellow named Mel Goodman, who worked with me way back when as a Soviet foreign affairs analyst, was in a position to see all this. And he went to his supervisor, a fellow named Robert Gates, who was head of analysis in those days at CIA. And he said, "Look, the Russians are taking this seriously. We have to warn the White House to tone this thing down." And Gates smiled and said, "Making the Russians comfortable has not been on the top of my to-do list. They're bluffing." Okay. So what did Goodman and two others do? They went around Gates, went right to Mr. Casey, the head of the CIA, and said, "Look, Mr. Casey, we've told our boss, but he doesn't believe it. We believe very strongly you have to tone this thing down because XXX is happening, and the guy in Gorgiev in London, the British are running. He's the KGB guy." He said, "This is the real thing. That's what we're telling our Russian superiors." So Casey says, Goodman and company leave. Next thing they know, the White House has been called by Casey, and the vice president involvement was knocked out, and they toned the thing down. The bombers were some of them brought back home, and so we escaped something that the Russians thought was the real deal. The name of that exercise was Able Danger. You want to look at that. I was briefing at the time. I was briefing one-on-one with the president's daily brief. So I know how labile, how dangerous it was. It came right after KAL, the Korean airline shoot down, where the Russians shot down an airline, and there were, I think, 329 passengers on it, something like that, and it was a civilian airline. And that happened on Labor Day, 1983. I had to brief on that. And the big questions, of course, were, did the Russians shoot down this aircraft deliberately? And I'd say, yes. But wait a second. The real question, Mr. Secretary, is, did they know it was a civilian aircraft? Well, did they? I don't know, but I'll get the specialists in here from NSA and from CIA, and they'll tell you a real professional judgment. When can you get them in? 10 o'clock? Okay. The bosses that were well over me at the CIA had nothing to do other than send their best people down. And the answer was fleshed out at the UN. People probably remember this when our representative got up there and said they did this deliberately. They killed civilians. They knew that was a civilian airline. And here are the tapes. And they played about 9 minutes of the tape. Now, several years later, the head of that taping unit in the State Department wrote a book. And he said, I was amazed because they deleted the part of that conversation, control tower to pilot, where the pilot says, I can't see what kind of plane it is. No, I can't. No, there was a RC 123 come through here, probably another spy plane, but we can't identify it. Well, does it flick your wings? Yeah, we flicked our wings, but okay, shoot. And they shot. So long story short, we did not know. Actually, we did know that, yes, the Russians shot down that plane deliberately. We also knew that they didn't know it was a civilian aircraft. They thought it was a spy plane. Now, this fellow, what's his name? Arlen, forget now. He wrote a book, okay? And what he said was, this is amazing, because I gave him the whole tape. And so they cut it down to size, so to speak, so it could be so detrimental to Russia. And my conclusion, he says, in best diplomatic State Department fashion, he says, well, the conclusion is everybody lies, including our country. And whoever lies first wins. Now, I mention that because that happened Labor Day, early September, right? And we're talking early November, 2 months later. And we had Reagan calling them the evil empire. And we had this distortion of the evidence. Now, the Russians knew that we were distorting it. They knew that we knew, that some of us knew, not the poor guy whose tape was cut to size, so to speak. But, they were really on tenterhooks and thinking, well, these guys really hate us, and they're going to finish off the evil empire with this exercise. Able danger, it's pretty well covered in Wikipedia. And my friend Mel Goodman, to his credit, went by his boss. He didn't last long after that. Bobby Gates, we're not going to promote Mel Goodman any longer, or he should have been promoted. So Mel went to work as a teacher. He's a professor at the National Defense University, and did really good work there. So there were a few of us that told the truth no matter what, even though it was not, as they called it, career enhancing, end quote.
Ray, it seems that when you look at the 2024 presidential election in the United States right now, and Republican Party and Democratic Party, the way that Trump is trying to picture the conflicts in the Middle East and in Ukraine, it seems that in his mind and in the mind of J.D. Vance, they're thinking that they're not interested in having a war with Iran or even putting an end to the conflict in Ukraine. On the other hand, Trump was talking about that maybe Mike Pompeo is going to be part of his administration if he wins. Here is let me share the screen with you. What Pompeo said is Newsweek in an interview on Fox News, he said that Donald Trump doesn't know what he's talking about in Ukraine, about the conflict in Ukraine. When you look at these two pictures, these people like Mike Pompeo, Nikki Haley, Tom Cotton, these people are totally in for escalating the conflict in Middle East, in Ukraine. And on the other hand, Trump is talking about now we are not interested. If these people get into the administration, if Donald Trump wins, first of all, and these people were able to get into the administration, do you think that the Donald Trump's administration going to be the Trump administration going to be the same as it was before in his first term?
Well, Nima, as you know, I spent a career and then several more decades trying to put myself in the shoes of Russian leaders. What I think really doesn't matter too much in the broad scheme of things, what they think matters. They're not kidding when Putin, for example, says, look, our preference is for somebody who's predictable, okay? And that, Putin says a year and a half ago, that is why we favor Joe Biden. Now, people say, well, he's just putting us on. No. I mean, just think about it. Russian leaders need to know that their counterparts across the Atlantic Ocean that have their fingers on the nuclear codes, that they're predictable. Trump never was predictable. That's why it was a farce beyond imagination to think that the Russians favored Trump in 2016. And I couldn't get that through the heads of anybody because of all this Russiagate stuff, which turned out to be a total false story. Okay, so what do they favor now? Predictability. Now, Putin later said, and this time he was sort of putting us on. He says, well, he's asked the question again. He said, well, now who do we favor? Well, of course, since Biden tells us to favor Kamala Harris, and then we favor Harris. Okay, well. And then there's a smirk and lots of laughter in the audience. Well, let's see about that. Who's more predictable, Harris or Trump? In my view, Putin has to come down to the realization that Trump is the least predictable of all. And he wouldn't want to deal with this guy who has threatened to bomb Iran out of existence, right? I mean, this business about is going to save Ukraine and settle the Ukraine thing in one day. Give me a break, you know. Putin says, "Yeah, I really like to know how he's going to make that happen." You know, he's not going to make that happen, and it'll be worse. How you can be worse than genocide in Western Asia? I don't know, but I'll just say rhetorically, it'd be worse. Look what he did. Giving parts of Syria to Israel, moving the capital, you know, all kinds of, some of them kind of not even required things, just to, well, anyhow, he's more a Zionist. Well, he's equally as Zionist as Biden. So it's really, really hard. I have been thinking that Trump had been plumbing for the peace vote and making himself out to be a peacemaker in Ukraine and just leaving West Asia aside, everyone knowing that there's no choice there. They're both Zionists, okay? I don't think that he can be predicted to be able to do anything, particularly since Congress, God knows what shape Congress is going to take. So these things being so tough to decide, you know, when people ask me, you know, what do you think? And I say, well, I have 10 grandchildren. What does that have to do with it? I said, well, you know, it's something like water and some air and stuff that they're going to need. So I take that into consideration. And then, you know, I have been thinking about the moral aspects of all this. Is it moral? Is it defensible to do the things that our foreign policy has been doing, to include genocide? I don't think so. The moral tradition out of which I come, and it's a biblical tradition common to Jews, Christians, and Muslims, so-called Abrahamic faith, is that we care first and foremost for the widow, the orphan, and the refugee. Okay, wow. You mean like our neighbor? We're supposed to love our neighbor? Well, yeah. Let me put it in John Mearsheimer terms first. The realistic school of international relations. I've learned that it's a key element in international relations to realize that there is no security for any one nation without mutual security. In other words, unless one nation feels secure, the other one can't feel secure, and vice versa. And that's what shut us all off here on this new Cold War. The US thought that we could make Russia feel insecure without making us insecure, and we've got a new Cold War, okay? So in one way, you could say that the golden rule, do unto others as you would have others, is no longer just a kind of moral tenet, but it's a practical necessity. And we see that played out in these geopolitical terms. In other words, if Russia feels threatened insecure by Washington and the expansion of NATO, then there can be no security for the US or NATO. And, these kinds of things make sense. So now in the moral sense, how about when CEOs of these profiteers on war make 50 to 70 times as much money as the average worker in Lockheed or Raytheon? So, whoa, is that going to cause some insecurity? Well, it already is. There are a lot of people stricken by poverty in our country, and as long as the rich keep getting richer and the poor keep being poorer, that's not security for anyone. And you can't build these gated communities, and put really strong gates and still try to get from fresh air there if there's nothing done about the environment. So it's all kind of puzzling. But what I come down to, for what it's worth, is that we are given a mandate in this Abrahamic tradition, and that is to take care of the widow, the orphan, and the refugee. In other words, people call it the preferential option for the poor. And if you look at the election in those terms, I think you kind of see what the moral perspective is, and that should weigh heavily in the minds of those of us who profess to be Christians or followers of Jesus of Nazareth. After all, some people would not agree with this, but Jesus of Nazareth was a prophet, right? And he could have died comfortably in his bed and been extolled as a Hebrew prophet, okay, if he just obeyed the rules. But the rules were oppressive, okay? He cared about the widow, the orphan, and the refugee, and that was not to be tolerated. He made a lot of mess in the temple there when they tried to, when they were abusing their privileges. And so he knew what he was doing. I don't think he knew what was going to happen to him. But that's why they killed him, folks. That's why they killed him. And they've killed lots of other people like that in the ages since. So, some people willing to die for that kind of thing. At least we should take note of it. And actually, I should mention that a very good friend of mine, a priest named Jennifer Copeland of the North Carolina National Group, the North Carolina Group of Churches. Okay, she's written an article calling It appeared in North Carolina newspapers. The title is "Vote with the Interest of Your Neighbor in Mind." I mean, you read it through it, you say, "Well, that's not me first anymore." Our tradition says, "Love your neighbor as yourself," and so I'm going on at more length than I expected. But if the preferential option for the poor means anything, and it is common, I mean, why do you think Hamas is so damn popular? Huh? You know? Because they took care of the poor, the orphans, the refugees, the widows. I mean, when the election happened in 2005, I think, they beat the PLO hands down. Why? Because they did these things, okay? Very much in the Muslim tradition. Used to be in the Jewish tradition of old. So, and I'm a Catholic, and I'll just sum up by saying that in the Catholic tradition, there was one point under John the 23rd, Pope John the 23rd, where the American Catholic bishops stood up, okay, and they wrote a couple of pastoral messages, big, big things, but very, very much to the point. One was on war and peace, that was good in its own, but one was on the U.S. economy. And the bottom line, and I'll finish with this, is, hey, say the bishops, you've heard us talk about the preferential option for the poor. Some of your pastors have mentioned it. We're going to tell you what it is, okay? What it is no one is entitled to accumulate still more of what he doesn't need, while other people are denied the basic necessities of life. And, end quote. So I believe that, and I look at the election in those terms, and I hope that people of faith who realize the stakes here, particularly the stakes for the widow, the orphan, and the refugee, will kind of have that to be one imperative in their reasoning, one reason to do the right thing, no matter how much they have to hold their nose.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Ray, for being with us today. Great pleasure, as
You're
always.
most welcome, Eva. Mm-hmm.